Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as 1 tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
Good day, and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, April the 24th. On this episode of The Word, hey, it is National Soil Conservation Week. We need to talk about that. A few frustrations that I'm having being a communicator, and then the rest of the episode is Agronomy Answers. Lots of stuff out there from across North America. I'll try to answer as much as I can. Let's go! Yes, National Soil Conservation Week. Really cool, timed perfectly. A study that I saw through Twitter, through Andrew McGuire. He's really good at tweeting out studies by AGA et al. And that study says, okay, so we're all pushing for, better microbial diversity, more microbial abundance in the soil. This soil life is really cycling the carbon and doing so much good for us. Man, he looked at all these different things: crop rotation, crop diversity, cover crops, residue, all this stuff that we talk about, and it's all good. But if you want microbial abundance and microbial diversity, there is exactly one thing that really matters, and that's how much tillage you do. The more tillage you do, the less abundance, the less diversity you have in your soil. The less tillage you do, those numbers just ramp up dramatically. And so on Soil Conservation Week, it is do less tillage. Now, that's all well and good, but the other side of that is that James from Northern Ontario saying, okay, I've got heavy corn residue. How does no-till soybeans work up when I've got 200 bushel corn residue? Do I do a bit of surface tillage? Like, how does that work from that standpoint? And he also said, I no-till soybeans after my wheat because there is no much residue. After corn, what's the outcome? And, the work that Horst Bonner has done, no-till soybeans can 100% work. They absolutely can. But we also know that the soil is going to be cooler. James is in a really short season area, getting that crop out of the ground early, getting lots of biomass before it starts to flower. We know the bigger plant we can get before it starts to flower, the better the yield's going to be. One pass of spring tillage, don't forget that 80% of the erosion happens during the non-growing months. So that's November to March. We get to May up at Earlton, or I forget exactly where James is from, but up in Northern Ontario. Man, I don't see much wrong with a single pass of some shallow surface tillage to get some black dirt there to bury some of that heavy corn residue and get the soybeans planted and off to a good start. And by the way, James, and I can just hear Tyler saying, oh, Peter, you're bashing no-till soybeans again. No, I'm not, Tyler. But James, do the trial. Try some no-till, but if you can get 3 or 4 extra bushels because of your location by one pass, 3 15s is 60, that will more than pay for that one pass, or pardon me, 4 15s is 60 if you get 4 bushels. Should think about my math there. In any case, 4 15s is 60. Your tillage pass is going to cost you 30 or 35. And so if you don't get 4, if you only get a bushel, man, just go no-till them. But if you're going to do tillage, I do think as little as possible, we want to support the diversity, support the abundance of microbes, and we prefer to keep it into the spring if we can to avoid the negative consequences of that tillage. Okay, I need to move on. Some days, man, it's like 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So I'm a communicator, right? I do the word. If I'm not a communicator, the word doesn't work, baby. And I thought last week I sort of covered it fairly well about leadership and about being right as opposed to having influence. And a caller called me back and said, Peter, Like, use your critical thinking skills. If you're right, you're not a leader. If you have influence, you're a leader. And that's exactly what I was trying to say. Man, I like to be right. I actually like it when I'm wrong, because when I'm wrong, I learn something, but I don't like to be wrong all the time. None of us do. But this particular caller said, man, I have no time for people who are right all the time. I hear you on that. But having influence is really what it's all about to be a leader. If I didn't make that clear, I am not a very good communicator. Staying on the communication skills, we talked lots about winter canola, and I am pretty high on winter canola. And maybe by the time harvest rolls around, I won't be quite as pumped. But it just seems like such a resilient crop now that we have Mercedes. So we have talked, and we talked on Monday's radio show, Sean and I. We got some questions from Alberta about growing winter canola in Alberta. And I did not know, and Ellen Sperry reached out to me and said, Peter, please understand that Mercedes is the only variety we are aware of that for sure doesn't bolt when you plant it early in the fall. So I said new genetics. Well, be careful with new genetics, because there very well could be new genetics, new canola, winter canola varieties that still bolt in the fall. If that's the case, those varieties will not work in our climate, and they won't work in Alberta either, in my opinion, just because we have to plant them early. And then if we get an open fall, they bolt in the fall, then they're done in the spring. So Mercedes is the variety. And by the way, and I had no clue about this, Mercedes is only registered in Ontario. So if you somehow get seed into Alberta or Western Canada, BC, whatever, and you grow it, well, when you go to deliver it, it goes into the lowest quality pool, just because that's how it fits. Like, it's an unregistered variety, so to speak, in that part of the world. And so lots of things to consider around that particular crop. And those things, yep, I just did not know. Thanks, Ellen, for putting the warning out. Meanwhile, a little while ago, I was so excited because the Philippines finally approved golden rice for use in their country, and it has a huge impact in terms of the number of kids that go blind because they are vitamin B deficient, beta-carotene deficient, and there's beta-carotene in the golden rice. Wouldn't you know it? Somebody filed a court case, and the courts in the Philippines have blocked the use of golden rice. And you just go, oh my gosh, talk about taking one step forward, two steps back. We will get through this technology thing. By the way, Diego from Argentina sending me a film. I haven't watched it yet, but a film that essentially takes aim at modern day agriculture. Diego says there's lots of mistruths in there. Yes. The fight goes on for common sense or for supporting technology. It is just astounding how hard that fight is, but we will continue to fight. That's absolutely true. And I continue to be a technology supporter, of course, used appropriately, always. You have to add that caveat. All right, I want to move on, and just a few other notes. Wow, it is wet in New York State, in Ohio. They are saturated. A number of people out of New York State reaching out to me. They cannot drive across their winter wheat, and they have been saturated all through March, all through April, and there's still water laying. It's just, how do we get nitrogen on that wheat crop? And I know in Ontario, and if you watch those storm systems, really interesting, most of them would track just south of the Great Lakes, maybe catch some of the Great Lakes or the very edge of Ontario along Lake Erie. But boy, the Ohio, New York State really getting pounded, so that's a tough situation to be in. You know, I got a phone call just this morning, Wednesday morning, from Kevin in Kansas, asking me about wheat. Their wheat in Kansas, central Kansas, has headed out. In the frosted area, they are absolutely seeing some frost damage on the heads, but where Kevin is, he doesn't have much frost damage. He's outside of that area. But he was asking me how much drought wheat can stand, because they have had not more than a half an inch or 13 millimeters of rainfall in the last 117 days. And it's just like, oh my gosh, New York's flooded. That is dry in Kansas. He did say, by the way, that the flag leaf and the second leaf down, the penultimate leaf, they both look fine. So that tells me that the wheat is getting water from deep. It isn't wiped out yet. But, the critical period for yield in wheat is from 14 days before heading to 10 days after heading. And, if you're heading, you need some moisture pretty quickly, or you're likely to see a lot of abortion, a lot of florid abortion at those spikelets and end up with less seeds per head. Okay, I want to move on, and just talking about this wet weather, Alan from Peel County texted me some pictures, and he has had 0 nitrogen on his wheat, and he has had, if I recall correctly, 9.5 inches of rain since whenever the rain started. And he can't get across that. And so the whole thought process is, how long can I tolerate not getting the nitrogen on the wheat? And I think we've talked about this, Alan. Absolutely, you need to get the nitrogen there as quickly as you can. You're at growth stage 31. It needs to be there by growth stage 32. Here's a note. Never once in Shane and my trials, I think I said this last week, but it's important, never once did delaying nitrogen application, even on advanced wheat to growth stage 32, increase yield. Mostly didn't lose much yield, but it never increased yield, so get there as soon as you can. But the other point that I really want to make here is that Alan was going to include some pure yield, some of the coated urea, in his application to make it like a split application, and I'm going, no way. Because number one, it needs nitrogen now. You're into the rapid uptake phase. It's 3 pounds per acre per day. You put pure yield on. Even the thinnest coating is typically a 30-day delay to that nitrogen becoming available. Man, it's going to become available when most of the uptake has already happened. To use pure yield back in March, that's one thing, because you have some time for it to become available and into the point where the crop needs it. Not now. We're out of that game. We want the urea. We want it available to change to ammonium, to change to nitrate, to feed the wheat crop. So if you're a one and done at this point in time, I don't think you are using any coated urea products. I just think it doesn't make sense in this situation. The other thing I do want to mention on this is back in March, we had great discussion about, it's March. It's too early to put nitrogen on wheat. We really have to get away from looking at the calendar, and we have to step back and look at the stage of the wheat crop. So Tom Haverstad from University of Minnesota tweeting out that it is the warmest winter since 1931 in Minnesota. It is 5 Celsius degrees above normal winter temperature for them. I think we're in the same boat from that standpoint. In fact, what's really cool, Christine Brown saying that given how warm February was and how warm the whole winter was in general, that we can probably count on more nitrogen from the organic portion of manure that we applied last fall than we would normally get. And it's really hard to know how much, but Chris thought, probably 10%. The only way to know for sure is a pre-hydrate nitrate test ahead of your corn crop, but really interesting that these warm temperatures do have that impact. Going back to the nitrogen on wheat, thankfully, we did get some growers who went out and did some plots. That was the suggestion. Go out, put on 30, 40, 50 pounds of nitrogen, not more than 50, because it is an environmental risk. The wheat was greened up. It was growing. My gosh, that wheat looks so amazing. I've seen some of the wheat that got that early shot of nitrogen is probably the best looking wheat crop I have seen in a decade. And it just proves to me that we have to quit looking at the calendar. We have to look at the growth stage of the crop. And if this happens again, and probably next winter will be super cold and none of this will matter, but if we get another February like 2024 February, I am not going to hold people back from the first small shot of nitrogen and sulfur in March, because if biomass makes big bushels, man, the wheat that got that early shot of nitrogen, it is amazing. So just a thought process moving forward. So here's the flip side of this. Paul and Daniel from Quebec tweeting to me how cold, and Woody did as well. Woody was only -4. Woody, -4 at growth stage 31 with that head right at ground level. Now, it's 100% fine. The critical temperature in the literature is 24 Fahrenheit, which is about -4.5 Celsius. In Quebec, they're worried about -5 Celsius for 4 hours. But remember, the science says that 24 Fahrenheit is at the jointing stage. If you're just at the beginning of the jointing stage, because before jointing, it's 12 degrees Fahrenheit or -10 Celsius, and it doesn't go immediately from, -10 to -5. As that head comes above the soil, it's more exposed, but don't forget that it's very close to the soil. The soil has some heat. And so in both Paul and Daniel's situation, -5 for 4 hours, yeah, that's close. But the other thing to look at is none of the foliage was damaged at all. If it was cold enough to kill the head or do damage to the head, I would expect to see some frost injury on the leaves as well. I think it's 100% fine, but we are going to be at risk of that. Craig texting me that his cereal rye that he's growing for grain is growth stage 32 to 37. Oh gosh, it's going to head out really early. If it heads out really early and we get that frost during heading, that's when it's really sensitive. So we do have to have a look at that or be aware of that, at least on these really warm winters. Josh asking, okay, Peter, we put the nitrogen on. Just quickly, what's going on? Yellow wheat in the hollows. Is it just wet feet? And the answer is absolutely. You put the nitrogen and sulfur on, but in order for the wheat to pick up the nitrogen, it's not a passive process. It has to respire. That soil is saturated. There's no oxygen, so it can't respire to take up the nitrogen. The other thing is that the nitrogen, the nitrate, it moves in the water to the roots. When it's saturated, there's no water movement, so it's not bringing the nitrogen to the roots. And the last thing is that if it's super saturated, then roots actually die, and it's the root tips that do the majority of that nutrient uptake. If you're not growing new root tips, or if the roots are dying, you're just not getting that nitrogen uptake. So 100%, it's a wet feet thing, and that's sort of where we're at. Going back to communications and Johnson's failures, Steve saying, okay, Peter, listen to the word. I'm a bit confused on this nitrogen rate on triticale. I've got 115 pounds of nitrogen on my triticale. Are you telling me I need to add another 60 pounds? Because, Tom Kilser out of Quebec says, out of New York State rather, says 200, up to 200 pounds of nitrogen. And the answer is no. If I recall correctly, the caller had 90 pounds or 100 pounds of nitrogen on, and I was suggesting he pushed it up to 120 or even maybe tried 140. Michelle Dernan from a great crop consultant, Prosperity Ag, which means, of course, prosperity. She works on wheat and triticale and barley mainly, right? Cereal crops, they're the prosperity crops. Actually, she works a lot of dairy farmers. And she is at 120 pounds of nitrogen on the triticale and slowly looking at higher nitrogen rates. She is looking at 140. I do know some growers, other places that are at 150, 160 on the triticale. But it matters a lot how much manure is in the history. And Adam actually tweeting back that his rye for heifer feed, he has not seen a yield increase over, I believe he said 90 pounds, but it might have been a little more than that. But he also was for heifer feed, he wasn't looking for protein. So it's yield is one thing, but the protein content is the other. If you want 20% plus protein crop, then you do need a lot of nitrogen there. So no, Steve, I wasn't suggesting another 60. 115 is pretty solid, but to go out there, as you said, you've got some 800 pounds left of ammonium plus, urea plus ammonium sulfate in the spreader. Go do a couple of strips and then make sure you get the protein tests and see if more nitrogen makes sense. Hey, Warren, 28% cheaper than urea. So Warren's saying, how is this possible? But I can buy 28%, 7 cents per pound of nitrogen cheaper than urea. That almost never happens. But in my corn program, if I switch from urea to 28%, what are the ramifications? What about a weed and feed? Can I use Roundup? So in a weed and feed, if you go over 10 gallons, by the way, personally, I don't like using 28% as a carrier, period, and adding the Roundup, but people that have tried it would say you can go up to 10 gallons of 28% and put the Roundup in, and you don't get enough leaf damage that the Roundup doesn't work. You still get efficacy out of the Roundup. And it's a little bit like streaming nitrogen on wheat. If you keep your streaming rate down to 10 or 15 gallons, we rarely see significant burn on the wheat. Man, you go up to 40 gallons, sometimes you can get really significant burning. So it's in that same game. If you need to, you maybe can. But if you're going to do 20 gallons, which is sort of what you probably want to do in a weed and feed, get good coverage, you can't put the Roundup in, so that's a challenge. Oren asks about stabilizer. Well, if you stabilize, fair enough. What risk are you at? Well, first off, only 50% is urea, and that's primarily what you're stabilizing is the urea, the prevent volatilization loss. So already 50% of the 28% is in a form that you don't worry about much loss. So you're only trying to save half, and then is the soil surface damp? Is it sunny and windy? And if you answer yes to all those three questions, stabilize. If the soil surface is dry and it's cool, probably you don't need to stabilize, particularly if there is rain in the forecast with a reasonable chance within a day or two, certainly within 5 days. Most of the loss actually happens in the first 5 to 7 days, so that's the time frame, the weather forecast to look at. Last, Warren says strip till versus conventional. Well, conventional, brown dirt, black dirt, it can be dry on the surface. Your risk of volatilization drops to zero because to get volatilization, you need moisture. Strip till, underneath that residue, likely some moisture, more urease enzymes in that residue in the strip till, and so probably a little bit higher risk of loss in strip till than there is in conventional tillage, although the work by Brant County really didn't show that. They actually showed more loss on conventional tillage than they did with no-till, so I think that's a real, I don't know, I think that's something we have to look at closer. All right, I'm out of time. I will talk next week about phosphorus banded by Greg because that's a really interesting discussion. And Spencer, I haven't forgotten your question around groundworks and woodrill and grid sampling, how that comes together. I'll have to do them both first next week. That's it. That's all. On behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture, this was Wheat Pete with the way too long word for Wednesday, April the 24th. Hey, keep the questions, keep the comments coming, and whatever you do, as you go to the field, please think twice, act once, be safe. Talk to you next week.